humor me then for a little bit and just hold off on getting too far ahead so we can get through this, Marquise. So far, we've learned 3 ways to do the exact same thing, which is to solve quadratic equations.
What do you mean 3 ways?
Well, now we're gonna get 4.
What?
When are we ever gonna use this?
Exactly.
Like, right? Never. Yeah.
Did you play blackjack anything yesterday?
No. I have not.
How was class yesterday?
How was class yesterday? It was sad. Lily Gio was not here. How do you pronounce your last name?
Like that. I'm sure it's pronounced differently before, but when my grandparents moved together to me,
Got it. Okay, so what are the 3 ways we've learned so far for solving quadratic equations? And no, you're not watching, and you're gonna do the wrong things. I didn't do a good job of putting directions on it. So, what are the 3 ways of that we learned already? Completing the square was one of them. That's what we did yesterday. Square root property and factoring. Okay. So the first one, factoring, that's a little bit limited, even though you may not realize it, because that cannot be used to find every type of solution. There are some solutions that cannot be found by factoring. You can only really use it to find rational solutions. Yes? Huh? Thank you. I didn't hear. Sorry. Square root property is a little bit limited because we can only use that when we only have a square term, not when there's like a b term. But then starting with yesterday with completing the square, which hopefully you understood, now we can solve and get any type of solution for quadratic equations. But now what the math gods have done for you is they've taken all the work from completing the square, and if you're not too bored and you want me to show you that, I could even show it to you, and done the solving for you. That's what quadratic formula is. Quadratic formula gets all the work from completing the square and has the variable already isolated for you, so that all you have to do is substitute. Yes, Lily.
So do your tardies or so every semester?
I don't know. That's fine. It wouldn't be the first time you're wrong. It won't be the last. So, eventually, by using quadratic formula, we don't have to do all the work we did yesterday of factoring and isolating and everything. What the formula allows you to do is just to substitute and evaluate. These become PEMDAS problems. You just have to know order of operations, which we'll talk about. But before we can do any of that, we're going to take it back to the old school and make the equations equal to 0. What was the other method that had us making the equation equal to 0? Putting all terms on one side. Factoring, yeah. It's kind of, and honestly, going forward, after we're done with this unit, if we ever encounter a quadratic equation again, the 2 most common ways of solving quadratic equations are factoring and quadratic formula. And they both ask you to make the equation equal to 0. So what is the quadratic formula if you haven't taken Algebra 1 before? Yeah, even if you haven't taken Algebra 1 before, this you should know already because this we've done it here. You should know the standard form of a quadratic equation and how to identify A, B, and C. The difference is instead of like putting these into a factor chart, now we're going to plug these into quadratic formula. This is a quadratic formula. I still remember when I took Algebra 1 in 8th grade, my 8th grade teacher forced us to memorize this. I think we even had a quiz. We even had a quiz where we just had to like literally write it down. And now you do pay attention, but then you have a teacher that's not that great. Well, it's because the teacher's not great, but at least you're paying attention this year. Still do vacuums. what are you going to do? You're going to substitute. The A goes in twice. Once inside the square root, once on the bottom of the fraction. The B also goes in twice. You substitute it twice, but we're definitely going to talk about B because I think that's where the biggest mistakes occur are with the B.
And then you put it into the calculator.
You put yourself into the calculator. And then plug in C, right? So it's just substitution and then evaluate. In my opinion, I don't have any data to support this, but in my opinion, though, the biggest mistakes that occur with quadratic formula occur with signs. People mess up the signs. They put a positive, but it should be a negative and vice versa. So I'm going to try to emphasize that throughout the lecture. The majority of the problems we deal with will ask us to solve. And in order to solve, we're going to use the quadratic formula. But there will also be problems, Anne, that ask you just how many solutions you're going to have. And if your problem is not asking you to solve and it's just asking you how many solutions, you don't need to use the entire quadratic formula. You just need to use the discriminant. Hint, 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 you will eventually be asked what a discriminant is. So make sure you know what a discriminant is. This is a discriminant. It's what's inside the square root. They're getting in the way of your artwork. So the discriminant is what's underneath the square root. That's important for two ways. If you are solving, that's what is used to start off. This is where we start off when we're solving. But if we're ever asked how many solutions, we only have to use that. We don't have to use the rest of the formula. What would we look for? Strangely enough, the signs. We just talked about signs. We look for the signs. What are the most amount of solutions that a quadratic equation can have? Just two. If I have a positive discriminant, once I substitute and I square and I multiply and I subtract, if I end up with a positive number, how many solutions do you think that's gonna? Yeah, that's when you're gonna have two real solutions. If you ever see the word roots, don't get that confused with like a tree. Root is just another word for solution. Another word that you could see is zeros. If they talk about zeros, like if it were like a noun, like a plural, like more than one zero, that could also be a solution. If they ask you about like the zeros of the equation. If you end up getting a zero for the discriminants, what do you think that means for the amount of solutions? One real solution. And then finally, you get a negative discriminant. If you get, yeah, because you think about it, if you're underneath a square root and you get a negative, in the past when I've asked you to put a negative and a square root into your calculator, what do you get? You get an error, so that's no real solutions. Eventually, to make it to Algebra 2, you'll learn about imaginary numbers. Lily's excited about that. She can't wait for Algebra 2. So there's only good vibes today. We're all having good vibes. Any questions? Brandon? Why the stink face? Kiara, you got a question? Are you angry today? You look angry. Okay, so here, this is the first one. Let's solve. Let's solve by quadratic formula. What does the first step say to do? Set the equation equal to 0. What can you tell me about that step? It's already done. So all we have to now we can go ahead and plug straight into quadratic formula. In order to do that, we need to identify A, B, and C just like we've done before. The difference is instead of putting it into a factor chart, we're going to plug it into the quadratic formula. I stated before that to me, the most common mistakes occur with signs, so pay attention. I'm going to tell you some things to watch out for. Because what's happened is a lot of you have become overly reliant on your calculator, And when you combine that with the fact that you don't really know how to use your calculator, that causes a mess. So, here, quadratic formula gets the variable already isolated. What's the variable here? What's the variable x? So it's going to say x equals. I don't have to do any work solving because solving means to isolate and the variable is already isolated. What comes first after the equal sign? What says negative b? What happens when you put a negative in front of an unknown? Right, any number you want. I don't want it to be known. Whatever number you want. Got it? What am I writing over here on the side on the dumb board? I just wrote a negative, right? So there's a negative. And in here, I'm going to eventually put a number that I do not know because she hasn't told me what it is. And smaller. Nice and big, sir. She wrote a number. She did it pretty poorly, but she wrote an 8. Look at what happens. When she wrote it, I didn't know what it was. I wasn't looking. And when I get that unknown number, I stick a negative in front of it. What does it become? Negative 8. Let's say she would have been really sneaky, though, and creative. And when she wrote that number on the page, let's say she would have written a negative 8. Instead, when I stick my negative in front of her negative, then it becomes a positive. So what happens when you stick a negative in front of an unknown? What happens when you stick a negative in front of an unknown number? When she gave me a positive, it became negative. When she gave me a negative, it became positive. It changes signs. So long story short, that's a minute of your life that you'll never have back.
You have a calculator.
No. Wait till you find out that the directions are different on some of these. If b is 8, what is negative b? Negative 8. You gotta make sure the first time you put in b, you change the sign. Okay. Then I have to put the plus or minus. Then comes the square root. No, now the second time you write b, you just write a regular b. Then I write a minus 4. Now I always get the question, wait, but Mr. Why minus 4? I don't see a 4 anywhere. Well, I do. I saw it on the formula that you were given originally. That's why there's a 4 there. And then somebody goes, but why? And the only way I could explain it to you would be to show you the complete derivation of quadratic formula, which again, I'm willing to do, but then that'll be about 15 minutes of your life that you'll never get back. Times A times C over 2 times A. And now it just becomes order of operations. Where did I tell you to start?
So we don't put the x in.
That's the whole nice thing about quadratic formula is that the only variable is off by itself already. So where did I tell you to start? Where did I tell you to start? On the second page of the notes where it says, hey, start here. Where do we want to start? Start off with the discriminant. What's the discriminant? The stuff that's underneath the square root. Okay? But again, look, I already told you one mistake, it might even be the most common mistake, is that people mess up with this sign here. Just as many times, especially calculator-related issues, people mess up with the sign inside of the square root. Because when I square a number, regardless of what that number is, what type of sign should I always get? I should always get positive. But what happens is, like, let's pretend there would have been a negative 8 in there, and you put it into the calculator and you square it. Since you don't know how to put it into the calculator the correct way with parentheses, your calculator tells you negative 64, and of course you write negative 64. But it's not. Every time you square, you should get a positive. So negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 64. Here's another trick I'll show you to try to avoid making mistakes with signs. Normally, I'm a big fan of doing one step at a time and not mixing steps, but here I'm actually going to tell you to mix steps. I just did an exponent. Go ahead and do the multiplication also at the same time. How many numbers do I see after square? 3. One of them is always going to be there, that negative 4. Okay, but then there's 2 more, meaning potentially, what is the least amount of negatives you could have? Yeah, you have to have at least one because that negative 4 is always going to be there. What's the most amount of negative numbers you could have? 3, because it is possible that all 3 of those could be negative. If you have an odd amount of negatives, either 1 or 3, keep the minus in the middle. If you have an even amount of negatives, which is 2, change it to plus. How many negatives do you see here after the square? Just 1. So keep the minus. And now what that allows me to do is not have to type in 1 negative into my calculator. I can forget any negatives that are there, and in my calculator, it's go 4 times 1 times 12. 48. Over. One more step, and I'll be done with the discriminant. X equals negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 16 over 2. I multiply what? Multiply what? Well, the only thing I've done so far is the discriminant. I ended up with a positive 16. So what I now know is how many solutions I'm going to have. Because I have a positive discriminant, how many solutions am I going to have? I am going to have 2 real solutions. And some of the advanced children that have already done quadratic formula before. The other thing you can tell is the type of solution you're going to have. But this is more kind of an Algebra 2 type concept, because not only is 16 positive, what other word that we've been using a lot lately can be used to describe 16? There's a word that we've been using a lot that also qualifies for 16. 16 also qualifies as perfect square. 16 is also a perfect square. So if your discriminant is not only positive, but it's also perfect, that means that your solution is going to be rational. Long story short, what that means is that you should be able to get rid of the square root entirely. If you can get rid of the square root, just like yesterday, if you can get rid of the square root entirely, you can do the plus minus, the whole splitting thing. If you cannot get rid of the square root entirely, then you can't do the plus minus. You might as well just leave it together. But Kai's excited. What's the square root of 16? 4. So negative 8 plus or minus 4 over 2. Because I was able to get rid of the square root, the next step is always the plus minus. And because there's no square root, I'm going to actually go ahead and split it. X is equal to negative 8 plus 4 over 2. X is equal to negative 8 minus 4 over 2. But wait, mister, my other teacher taught me that you can just leave it together. Yeah, but then what? Yeah, and here you get lucky because both numbers are divisible by 2. But what if they weren't? And even if they was divisible by 2, you'd still have to both add and subtract. I don't see why you wouldn't want to split this. X is equal to negative 4 over 2. X is equal to negative 2. X is equal to negative 12 over 2. X is equal to negative 6. Any questions there? Emiliano, you got a question? No? That's a very good question. Do I have more than one solution? Yeah, so you should write a solution. So thank you. Okie dokie, artichokes. -2 and -6. What does the first step say to do? Set the equation equal to 0. Move all the terms to one side. How many terms are there? There are 3 terms. Now you might remember with factoring that we really did not want to end up with a negative lead with factoring. With quadratic formula, you could actually get away with it. Even if you were to somehow leave that number in front of the square negative, if you do quadratic formula correctly, you can still get the right solution. But the fact that there's an extra negative there when it doesn't have to be, I think might lead you might be more likely to make a mistake. So I really don't care one way or the other, but I would have probably advised against it. So I'm going to be smart about it, and I'm going to add x squared to both sides. So x squared plus 6x plus 9 is equal to 0. Your board changed. Oh, your bottom board changed. Oh, you're different. Now we're ready to identify A, B, and C. Also bigger. I mean, I don't know if you believe in like using context clues. That's why there's a.
Yeah.
Okay. There's only good advice.
Wait, if you don't try that one.
That's not how.
Oh, I asked first.
Yeah, I'm a boy.
I don't know what gender you are. What are you guys confused? No, I'm way smarter. Right.
All right, let's substitute. X is equal to, if b is 6, what is negative b? -6. Plus or minus the square root of 6 squared minus 4. A is 1, 9. What's the name of the part that we start at? Better learn that name. What is it? Discriminants. Keep the 6 negative, plus or minus. 6 squared is 36. How many negatives come afterwards?
Is that a negative 4?
It is. It's always a -4. That's always there. It's the new board. I think it's because this now supports a feature called multi-touch. So like my last board, watch this. Like I couldn't do that with the last board. So I think what happens is that it causes it sometimes to drag like that. You get like little extra streaks. Maybe it's also because I'm not the best. I don't have the best handwriting. How many negatives come after the square? Just 1, and 4 times 1 times 9, according to Jair, is 36. Uh-oh, spaghettios. -6 plus or minus the square root of 0 is equal to 2. What type of discriminant did I end up with? 0, which means how many solutions am I going to have? 1. So here's what this means. Not only is the square root going to cancel, because anything plus 0 and anything minus 0 is itself, the plus and minus cancels too. Which means I don't have to split, and that one solution that you said we're going to get is just the 2 numbers that are left over divided. What is what is -6 divided by 2? Jada, because I have one solution, do I have to write a solution set? No, but can you? Yeah, we can. I doubt we're gonna get to an example like this, so just so that you know now, we can try to get the most out of each example. I have now done one equation that had a positive discriminant. I've now done an equation that has a 0 discriminant. What would have happened if I would have gotten a negative discriminant? Like, let's say, yeah, and not only would it be no solution, I could actually stop right here after this step. If I would have ended up getting like in here like a -8, I could just stop and just write no solution. Don't say I didn't tell you. So, and what? Oh, wait, not yet. One more. What should we do here? We got to make it equal to 0, but in order to get it in standard form, yeah, we should also distribute. If you don't know how to distribute, just watch Emiliano. He's an expert at distributing properties. Not yet, but I'm going to. And then you subtract 3. 2x squared minus 2x minus 3 is equal to 0. Trying to take 2 math at the same time instead of 1?
Yeah, I know.
Because more math is more fun.
I could take an algebra, maybe I don't know.
Yeah. Practice test. Friday.
Why are we taking a practice test?
If you are going to take a real test, you come back.
Wait, what? You expect me to remember all that after my week?
Well, no, you know, I don't expect to remember anything. I'm not even sure you're going to learn it in the first place. But we have talked about this before. That, yeah, even though it might seem weird to take a practice test before you go on break, it's not too bad because when we take a practice test before we leave on break, what are we going to do the day that we come back? Review it. Yeah, so. Maybe you'll be a famous rapper.
I don't want to do that.
X is equal to, and don't just always get in the habit of putting X. I'm just putting X because that's the variable. If it would have been Y's up there, I put Y equals. If there would have been P's up there, I put P equals. If B is negative 2, what is negative B? Positive 2. Don't forget the first time you write the B to change the sign. That is critical. Theoretically, the second time you write the B, even if you were to screw that up, the fact that you're squaring it should almost auto-correct it, but sadly that doesn't always happen. 4 C over. So then 2 plus or minus square root of, what's negative 4 squared? Damn it. What's negative 2 squared? No. 4, thank you, 4. How many negatives do you see after the square? 2. There are 2 negatives because I have the 4 that's always negative and now the 3 that's negative, so I'm going to put this to a plus. By knowing that rule, now I don't have to potentially make a mistake by forgetting to put a negative into my calculator or typing it in wrong. In my calculator, I would just put 4 times 2 times 3, unless you can do it in your head. I can do it in my head, I get 24. 2 times 2 is 4 also. You know that wall spelled backwards is wow?
You know race car spelled backwards is right?
You know what that's called when you spell?
Magic?
No. Double entendre? It's called a palindrome. How many solutions am I going to have? 2, but unlike the first one that we did when we weren't wearing a hoodie, 28 is not perfect, which means that we're not going to be able to completely get rid of the square root, which means that we're not going to be able to do the plus or minus, which means that splitting is not going to really do us any good. But even though we can't bring the entire 28 out, maybe we can get part of it out by doing the factor tree. Emiliana, can you take the hoodie off before you go to nap time? Thanks, man. See you later. Huh? What can I bring out? Yeah. So we got x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 7 over 4. You know that what spelled backwards is T-Haw? Or T-I? Actually, I think I messed it up. Yeah, it should just be tall. Yeah. Because I got stuck with a radical, that means I cannot add or subtract, so I'm stuck with a plus or minus, which means that I shouldn't split. It's really not going to help me. But what you might be able to do, there's always going to be 3 outside numbers. Even if you can't see one, there's a 1. There's always going to be 3 outside numbers. If those 3 outside numbers have a common factor, you can divide. You can bring out the common factor. You can divide it out. Is there a common number that I can divide 2 and 4 by? By 2. So divide them all by 2. So this becomes a 1. This becomes a 1, and this becomes a 2. So x is equal to 1 plus or minus. I don't need to write the second one because there's a square root of 7 right next to it, over 2. Jada, how many solutions are there? No, if there's a plus or minus, there has to be 2. You should write the solution set. Ever had that with Nutella? Nutella goes with everything. Any questions there? So, all right, on these now, we're not going to actually solve these. We're just going to figure out how many solutions we have. The approach we're going to take is the exact same thing as if we were going to solve it, though. What's the first step say to do? Make the equation equal to 0, which here has already been done for us. Identify A, B, C. Okay. But now, instead of substituting it into the entire quadratic formula, we only need to plug it into the discriminant. If all we're being asked is how many solutions, instead of plugging into the entire thing, just plug it into b squared minus 4ac. If you get a positive number, there's 2 solutions. If you get a 0, there's 1 solution. If you get a negative, there's no real solution. So b is negative 4 squared minus 4, a is 1, c is negative 5. Negative 4 squared is 16. How many negatives come after the square? 2, so I write a plus. 4 times 1 times 5 is 20, which gives me 36. Somebody this morning goes, oh, well, wait, Mr. Romero. Yeah, that's positive. So that means I'm going to have 2 real solutions. But then they're like, oh, but Mr., what's the other solution, though? 36 is not a solution. I haven't solved that. I didn't plug this into the full formula. I only plugged it into the discriminant because I wanted to see if it was positive or not. So because 36 is positive, that means I'm going to have 2 solutions. I don't know what they are, though. I haven't solved. Yes? No, like another 3 to 4 maybe. Even though I didn't do a good job of putting the directions on this one. What I want you to do here is the same thing. I want you to tell me how many solutions? What should we do first? What should we do first? What should we do first? Why? What are we trying to do? Yeah, write this on your notes. Write down how many solutions. I'm not solving here. Set the equation equal to 0. So mark the yes. In order to set the equation equal to 0, I want to distribute 12x squared plus 12x is equal to -3. One more step. Shelby, what's the next step to make it equal to 0? What's the next step? Yes. Yeah, add 3 to both sides. So I end up with 12x squared plus 12x plus 3 is equal to 0. So A is equal to 12, B is equal to 12, C is equal to 3. Oh, there's some ugly 12s. But now, since I only want to know how, yes, question? Since I only want to know how many solutions, I'm not going to plug these numbers into the full quadratic formula. I'm only going to plug it into b squared minus 4a. 12 squared is 144. 4 times 3 times 12 is 144. So Nakai, you said no solution? How many? There should be, yes, Jada, question? 0 is a discriminant. So when the discriminant is 0, how many real solutions are there? 1. Go back and look at the notes. 1 real solution. Jair, are they like giving frequent flyer miles in the bathroom now? Because you seem to go like every single day. Oh, every day, huh? I want to go get that checked out, dude. Remember also, you see that sign down there that says a phone with an arrow? That means you should leave your phone down there. I highly doubt that. I don't care, just leave it here. Don't worry about it. I'll protect it with my life. Adam will not take it, I promise. Okay, same thing for this one. Even though I didn't write it on the slide, you write it on your notes. Just tell me how many solutions. This will be the last one that we do like this. And some of this will show up on that test tape when we come back and we've forgotten everything. First step.
I can read it.
Add 3 to both sides. 3x squared plus x plus 3 is equal to 2. I'm going to identify A, B, and C, but if the question is only asking me how many solutions, I'm just going to plug it into the discriminant. So I get 1 squared minus 4 times 3 times 3, which is 1 minus, because there's only one negative, 36, which is negative 35. Does it mean that negative 35 is a solution? It just means how many solutions are there? No real solutions. Fortunately, once you get to Algebra II, you will learn that there are imaginary solutions. You get to use your imagination. It's easier than Algebra I. Yeah. During the break? Not really, no. Just a current assignment for this week. We'll just stretch over until after when you come back. No, I can't get, like less than half of you do the regular work that I give you. Why would I give extra work? Yeah, well, I can. Trust me, if I could give you extra credit, I would, but I'm not even allowed to give extra credit. All I would do is give extra work, and then the ones that end up getting penalized are the ones that normally do the work because they're the only ones that are going to do it. And people that normally don't do anything, they don't get to enjoy their Thanksgiving while they can spend it working when you come back from break. I'm not giving you any extra work, but I am giving you that extra week to do the current work that we have now. All right, let's go back to solving. Let's see if we can do two more at least. Oh, by the way, remember to bring your systems of equations test tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to be reviewing the factoring test, and if we have time, we'll do the systems test also. I already passed it back to you. A nap, no. Sam, what's the first step? And how can I do that here? Minus 11x. And because of that x, be careful that when you write it in standard form, make sure that you are writing the negative 11 before you write the 3. And you finished the packet already. If b is negative 11, then what is negative b? Negative 11. Jair helps to listen. Positive 11. Thanks, Jair. So plus 11 plus or minus square root of negative 11 squared minus 4. A is 10. C is 3 over 2 times 10. So x is equal to 11 plus or minus the square root of positive 121. How many negatives come afterwards? 1, so that becomes negative 120 over 20. What's 121 minus 120? 1. It's 1. And that not only is 1 positive, which means I should have 2 solutions, it's also perfect, which means I'll be able to get rid of my entire square root, which means I can split it. So x is equal to 11 plus or minus 1 over 20. X is equal to 11 plus 1 over 20. So x is equal to 12 over 20. So when you divide each one by 4, it becomes 3 over 5. X is equal to 11 minus 1 over 20. X is equal to 10 over 20. X is equal to 1. Did I go too fast on that last part? Do we know how to solve the linear equation part? Or do you think I went too fast? No. Jada, how many solutions are there? 2, so write a solution to that x can be 3 over 5 or it can be 1 5. Word. That's not what I want. This will. Perfect. All right, here we go. Let's solve this one. Find this one on the first step says 2. Yeah, and that's already done for you. So A, B, C, wouldn't want to be A is 2, B is negative 5, C is negative 7. So let's solve x is equal to. If b is negative 5, then I'm going to write 5 plus or minus the square root of negative 5 squared minus 4. Oh, not what I wanted. Whatever, I'll finish it with what I wanted. X is equal to 5 plus or minus square root of 25. There's 2 negatives, so I add. And then this is, what, 56 over 4. So x is equal to 5 plus or minus the square root of 81 over 4. 81 is positive and perfect. The square root of 81 is 9. Because I was able to do the square root. And since you finished the entire packet, did you get no solution on any of them? That's what I was looking for, a no solution. The last one gave you no solution?
No, like there's only one.
The one that I did, that gave us, that's the only one. So x can be 5 minus 9 also over 4. So x is 14 over 4. 7 over 2. And x is negative 4 over 4. So x can be 7 over 2 and negative 1. Here, let's do this. Go to this one here, and instead of a 7, let's make this a 17. Just to get you mad. First step would be set it equal to 0, so minus 2 minus 2. And we get 3n squared plus 8n plus 15 is equal to 0. So my A is 3, my B is 8, and my C is 15. So when I substitute n, now not x, n, yeah, I made it up. Like I asked you to go change it to 17. I'm trying to demonstrate something. The ones I had didn't. So change the 8 to negative 8 plus or minus. It depends when you write a 1 in front of the 7. Minus 4 A C over n is equal to negative 8 plus or minus square root of 64 minus over 6. Uh-oh. What did I want to show you? That I get negative 116 in here. So once I get a negative discriminant, I can just stop what I'm doing and say that there's no solution. No real solutions.